Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you reside. My name is Kyle Benaz. I'm the Director of Marketing at Netreo. I'm also joined by Andy Markowitz, our Technical Product Manager. So today we'll be discussing tips and tricks to Microsoft Azure monitoring and covering the newest addition to Netreo's product lineup, which is adding visibility to Azure Kubernetes environments. So before we get started, I'd like to cover a few quick housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we like to keep our webinars interactive. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them using the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try and get those answered as they come in. We've also allotted some time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So with that, let's get started. So on the agenda, we'll first go into a small bit of background on the subject area. Then we'll discuss some of the challenges we've heard about from our customers and others with regard to getting visibility into cloud resources. After that, we'll dive into the specifics of Azure monitoring and how to tackle these challenges. We'll provide some tips, tricks, and general best practices worth pursuing in your own environment. Next, we'll explore Netreo's new aaS or Azure Kubernetes Service visibility feature set. And lastly, we've earmarked some time at the end for your Q&A as mentioned before. And with that, let me turn the presentation over to Andy. Andy, the virtual floor is yours.
All right, thanks very much, Kyle. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So, when we're looking for topics to discuss in our webinar series, we get our ideas from a variety of sources. However, the two most common are going to be products that we have released or are planning on releasing in the near future, and then direct conversations with our customer base. Right, and now in the case of this particular topic, it happens to be a little bit of both. Our operations and support organization is starting to see a higher frequency of our customers dive into Microsoft Azure and deploying resources in the cloud. Consequently, right, more and more questions are starting to come up in terms of getting cloud and hybrid infrastructures monitored. Similarly, the first new feature we're releasing under the combined efforts of Netreo and our recent acquisition of CloudMonix is visibility into the Azure Kubernetes service. So this webinar felt like the perfect opportunity to expand upon both topics, and here we are. Now, in the interest of brevity, I'm going to make the assumption that everybody listening today has at least a cursory knowledge of what the Netreo IT management solution is and what it does. For those of you new to Netreo, again, thank you for your time. And secondly, at the conclusion of this session, please let us know if you'd like additional information, and one of our account executives will get in touch with you. All right, so let's first go into a tiny bit of background here. What exactly is cloud computing? I mean, we know it's all the rage right now and all the cool kids are doing it, but what does it actually mean? Now, just so we can level set and make sure we're all working off the same explanation, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm defining cloud computing as the on-demand availability of computer system resources without direct active management by the user. Now, the overall idea behind cloud computing isn't particularly new, right? Companies like Exodus and Verio were around during the time of the dot-com boom with the value proposition of, you don't want to be in the business of managing all the headaches that come with running a data center. Pay us and we'll handle things like power and AC and bandwidth and maybe even remote hands. You just worry about your customers. Now, co-location facilities are still very prevalent among today's IT landscape. In a way, you could think of cloud computing as one evolution of the co-location facility, but on a much, much larger scale. Of course, there's a lot more to cloud computing than just really massive scale co-location services. There are a number of different cloud services now offered by vendors. The more popular ones, we've got infrastructure, platform, software, and then function as a service. Now, the most fun example I could find when describing the differences between all of them was comparing them to automobile transportation. Right, so first you have infrastructure as a service. This would be the closest cousin to the aforementioned co-location facility. In a nutshell, you're renting virtual machine computing resources from your vendor. This is similar to leasing a car. You don't own it, but you can drive it anywhere you want, whenever you want, right, within limits of the law. Now, next, you have platform as a service. This type of service is basically computing resources that you rent, and it provides an environment for developing, testing, and managing applications. You don't have any visibility into hardware or low-level details. You just know a service is there to help you run your applications, not unlike a taxi service. You don't drive the taxi yourself. You just tell the driver where you need to go, and then you sit back and relax. Now, the third type of cloud computing resource is software as a service. This is the most easily identified. It's a shared service that you log into with credentials, and it's meant to perform a purpose-driven task, and that's it. As a user, you have no knowledge of any of the details under the hood. It's comparable to riding a bus. Buses have assigned routes, and you share the route with other passengers. Now, last on the list is function as a service. This type is the relative newest kid on the block. It's essentially a serverless computing paradigm, if anybody's heard that term. So what exactly does that mean? Application developers effectively write blocks of code and then submit it to a vendor for execution based on certain conditions. So for example, you might run a shopping cart program every time a user clicks on an item to purchase, right? That's simplified, but you get the idea. In terms of the transportation analogy, the best example I could think of was something like a handheld satellite radio receiver, right? Regardless of how you get from point A to point B, you could carry your Sirius XM device with you in any vehicle and get services. Okay, so what you see here inside the cloud image is, inside this cloud image, these are 4 types of the cloud resources I just talked about. So Magneto is an e-commerce platform used by many organizations. Lambda is an AWS implementation of function as a service. And then of course there's Netreo with our Netreo cloud monitoring SaaS offering. Of course, the topic at hand today is the monitoring of Microsoft Azure resources. So what you can see here as it transitioned in, right, is Azure also offers all of these same services, so platform, function, so on and so forth. Now, there are myriad benefits to transitioning your organization's IT resources into the cloud, right? Even if only partially, right? According to the most recent Flexera RightScale State of the Cloud report, 58% of companies employ a hybrid cloud strategy, up from 51% just last year. And at least from the perspective of this humble product manager, I don't see that trend tapering off anytime soon. Now, all of that said, the move to the cloud doesn't come without its challenges, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch, and monitoring is potentially one of them, but why? Right, so the first is environmental complexity. This challenge is more prevalent in hybrid environments than it is in 100% cloud native architecture, but it represents the lion's share of organizations anyway, right? Getting a single comprehensive view of all your IT resources, regardless of where they're deployed, is hard, right? Perhaps your company subscribes to several SaaS services, runs Exchange and some applications on SharePoint solely in Azure, but you also have to maintain on-premises gear for one department that still uses a mission-critical legacy application, and it can't be replaced, or it has to be there for regulatory purposes, right? In that scenario, the how, what, and where of monitoring isn't necessarily an easy question to answer. Now, one of the nice things about adopting cloud-based resources is that it's as simple as a few clicks of a mouse in a browser window to spin up and or destroy resources, right? In a microservice architected environment, you don't even need that. Resources can come and go automatically based on application need. In the case of function as a service, right? Functions, when they run, they often consume resources for less than 100 milliseconds and then disappear again. That's certainly convenient for developers and it's great for customers, but it's a nightmare to try and monitor. If your NMS system isn't ready for prime time, you're gonna run into challenges. Okay, and then last on the list is real service availability, right? How do you know if things are really working or not? With the exception of infrastructure as a service, right? None of the resource types I've already mentioned give you visibility to operating system level metrics. When those vendors do provide service status and performance data, and they do, it's from the perspective of their infrastructure, not yours, and most certainly not your customers, right? That's problematic and an issue that needs to be addressed when it comes to cloud monitoring. Okay, so let's get into some of the things we think are best practices with regard to monitoring Microsoft Azure cloud resources, and we're going to start with availability. So when I say availability, what I'm specifically referring to is the binary state of a given resource, right? Is it available or is it not available? This needs to be the first level of any monitoring solution and makes logical sense because if a resource isn't available, right, then nothing else about it really even matters. Depending upon the types of cloud resources you've deployed, you'll want to track up-down status of your VM guests or OS level processes and services. If you've deployed function as a service, then it's necessary to track the result of that function. Did it do what it was supposed to do, right? The answer to that question is binary in nature as well, right? And the same is true of synthetic checks and synthetic transactions. Did the transaction work or did it not? If you've deployed all types of these resources, then availability for each should be checked. Now, what we're looking to achieve here isn't whether or not a resource is up. It should be obvious why that's important, right? Rather, what we're looking for is availability from multiple perspectives to ensure things are working the way they should. Now, as you can see in this screen print here, The easiest way to get this kind of insight is to take advantage of the Azure setup wizard that's in Netreo Essentials. By simply providing Netreo with credentials to your Azure tenant, all the resources available for checking will be detected, and then you'll have the opportunity to get them configured for monitoring. Now, the next area we want to look at from an Azure monitoring perspective is performance data. Now, the distinguishing element here, as opposed to availability, is that performance data is some kind of a time series metric that we can use to judge how healthy a given resource is. In other words, we already know the resources are up, but what kind of shape is it in? Now, a term that's gained popularity over the last several years as cloud computing has become more prevalent are the so-called golden signals. Now, regardless of your source for reference materials on the topic, you'll find some variation of this list. Although these terms may seem self-explanatory, they're worth quickly enumerating, right? So request rate, it's simply going to be the rate of requests made to your resource per second. Similarly, error rate is the rate of errors generated by your resource per second. Latency is how long on average it takes for requests to be serviced, right? Saturation asks the question, how overloaded is my resource? And then lastly, utilization asks, how busy is my resource over time? And it's usually expressed as a percentage from 0 to 100. Now, aside from the metrics themselves, there are a couple important characteristics to note. Now, the first is what we're talking about here is resource agnostic, right? For example, error rate could just as easily apply to a fast function as it could apply to a web page that serves content, as it could apply to errors on a WAN link, right, to a remote site. If that happens to be the case, since we're talking about cloud computing, that isn't usually the case though, right? And the second thing to note here is that oftentimes these signals are indirect measures, right? In other words, it's not likely you're going to look at an API reference for a vendor and see in big bold print, look at this value for saturation levels, right? Instead, the actual statistic in that case might be measured by something like disk queue depth, right? The point is, in order to set up this kind of monitoring, personnel are likely going to have to know something about the application, right, and the innards of the application, or they're going to have to find somebody who does. Okay, so why do these metrics matter? Why isn't it sufficient to say I want CPU utilization on resource X and free disk space on resource Y? The truth is variables X and Y may very well tell you something, but without additional context, you're going to have to do more digging, right? You can think of it as a bottom-up approach to ferreting out your problem, whereas using the golden signals, you're working top-down. The reality is that the latter metrics are, right, they're directly what affect your end user and output producing parts of the system, right? These are things that impact your users and what your users perceive as the effectiveness of your application. So the $64,000 question is, how do you get there, right? Ultimately, you need to find the variables that will allow you to derive the information you need. As with availability, like I mentioned a moment ago, Netreo Essentials has a setup wizard, which can show you all the metrics that are available to track. Now you combine that with some application know-how, and you're off to the races.
Hey, Andy, real quick, I'm going to interrupt here because it looks like we had a question come in. So this question is, what kind of access permissions does Netreo need to get these metrics to show up in the UI?
That's a great question. Okay, so in order for these stats to show up in the Netreo Essentials UI, you're going to need an Azure Active Directory account with administrative privileges, or an account that is allowed to create service principals and have owner or contributor permissions to the tenant. Excellent question.
Thanks, Andy. And
yep.
I encourage everybody to keep those questions coming in, and we'll get those answered.
All right, so another crucial aspect of Azure monitoring is going to be something known as telemetry. Now, telemetry is diagnostic and performance information metrics that are pushed into your management system, analyzed, and then consumed by your technical personnel or other tools, right? Now, there's a couple technologies here you do want to be aware of, right? The Azure Event Hub is actually an event processing cloud service that can ingest millions of events per second and make them available for storage and analysis. So it's doing all the heavy lifting and then giving your monitoring system the quote unquote good stuff, right? Now, there is enough variations where we could probably dedicate an entire webinar to Event Hub visibility alone. But for the purposes of this session, just note that that the Event Hub is an important part of your monitoring strategy. Now, the other element I've noted on here are the traditional sources of telemetry data feeds, right? Which is going to be syslog, Windows Event Log, and SNMP traps from whole VMs within your environment. These are long-established protocols, and they're most likely going to come into play with legacy applications, right? But regardless of the source, right, they can provide you with a wealth of information, and that stuff shouldn't be overlooked. Okay, so by adding telemetry sources to your monitoring regime, what you're guaranteeing is full coverage, right? Both pushed and pulled data, and that can be used to help you track the health of your applications, right? Because in the case of push data, right, it isn't necessarily on a scheduled interval. It's just going to show up when it's ready, right? So when you add those two, when you add the push and the pull data, and telemetry is just a fancy word for push data, right? You're going to get that full perspective. Now, the Netreo Essentials configuration wizard will also detect all of your Event Hub namespaces that exist within your tenant, but you can just as easily add them manually to your deployment as a separate data type.
Hey, Andy, before we move on to the next slide, we do have another question here.
Sure.
So does Netreo support NSG flow logs?
Interesting. Okay, so the short answer to this question is not yet. Now, for the uninitiated, NSG flow logs are short for Network Security Group flow logs. Now, folks listening that might have a network engineering background know that NetFlow traffic collection is an extremely useful telemetry-based protocol that provides traffic accounting information, like source and destination ports, volume of traffic, and other goodies. NSG flow logs are basically that, but it tracks traffic information between Azure resources. AWS has something similar it refers to as VPC flow logs, right? We're evaluating the addition of both of those features for inclusion in upcoming releases. All right, so so of course, I mean, monitoring is only, when we're talking about getting visibility, right? Monitoring is only part of the story. You also need to be concerned about notifications from your resources and integrations into other management tools that you may have deployed as well. Now, quite simply, when we say notifications, we're talking about taking the data observed by your management system and acting upon it in some manner. Now, there are two primary ways that these actions manifest themselves. The first is ITSM ticket creation, which is typically done either via webhook API calls or through direct email message to an SMTP gateway. Obviously, this also means that direct emails could be sent to human recipients as well. Now, the second are automations, or what we've always referred to on the Netreo side as active response, right? Rather than send an email or open a trouble ticket, actually have your NMS take action in response to a problem. And I'll expand on this topic in a few minutes here. Now, when it comes to notifications, right, the other thing to be cognizant of is that you want to do your best to configure your system to generate only actionable alerts. So what does that mean, right? Hyperbolically speaking, unless you're prepared to drop everything you are doing and address a problem, don't have it send an alert or open a trouble ticket. And I'll expand on this topic in just a second as well. So right now, as I previously alluded to, watching your resources is only part of the equation to keeping your Azure tenant in tip-top shape. Action's imperative, whether that means runbook automation or integrating your IT service management system with the other tools and applications you might have running in your Microsoft-hosted environment.
Hey, Andy, real quick, we actually had another question come in.
Sure.
The question is, are there webhooks for Slack / Microsoft Teams?
There are, in fact. I was just about to mention, and the screen print is pretty low. When I get to the demo in just a second, I'll show this screen. But yeah, I mean, Netreo Essentials integrates with more than 20 different ITSM tools. Slack happens to be one. All those aren't specifically ITSM systems. There are webhooks for them, right? And so the integrations dialog, which we'll go into in a little bit, right? It makes it easy and intuitive to just set this up. There isn't a ton to it. Very simple to do. Great question. All right, so now a close relative to the idea of notifications and integrations is the concept of NMS reporting, right? Now, they're not analogous, but notifications and reporting complement each other quite well, right? Now, what we're talking about here is the extraction of data from your NMS system, right, for decision-making and action plan purposes. And there's three reasons reporting is important. The first is the idea of visual dashboards into your environment. Now, what I have here in this screen is an Azure blob storage dashboard from a test lab environment. Now, it quickly shows me at a glance availability, and if you can make out the rather small print there, two of the golden signals I mentioned earlier, right? Total request to the resource and then response time. The point here is that dashboarding is an essential part of any monitoring strategy, right? Now, the second reason noted here simply says persona specific, right? Basically, when you generate what I've come to call tearaway reports from your NMS, that data should likely be geared towards specific roles within your organization. Maybe that means a summary of Azure billing and overall system uptime for your IT leadership on one hand, or a report of active incidents for your NOC operators to triage on the other hand. Now, the last reason mentioned, and I would argue the most important of the three with regard to reporting, is that it helps with noise abatement in your environment. Now, when I said a moment ago that you only want to have your system configured for actionable alerts, that doesn't imply you don't want to be notified about problem conditions, because that would be silly, right? Rather, the better place for notifications of non-actionable notifications, right, is in structured periodic reports that let you prioritize and address issues on an as-needed basis. I would be absolutely shocked if anybody listening on this session has at some point in their career experienced a problem with what we call alert deluge, right? Now, because when you look at your inbox or your ITSM ticket queue or wherever you're tracking these things, and if there's 100 issues awaiting action, stuff is going to get missed, right? We're only human, and it happens to everybody, right? Another way maybe to state that problem is that if everything is critical, then nothing is critical. So you really want to take advantage of reporting when it comes to Microsoft Azure or anything. So, we talk about, why does reporting matter in your environment, and the why should be self-evident, right? I mean, for one thing, you won't miss incidents like I was just talking about. Two, you're going to reduce your MTTR, and then three, an extension of reducing MTTR is you're likely going to have higher satisfaction from your end users and customers. Generally speaking, the wider the visibility to your systems and things, the better. Now, in terms of getting you there, Netreo Essentials has a full complement of report types that can be run ad hoc or scheduled and delivered where necessary. And again, I mean, regardless of whether you run a 100% native Azure environment, only on-prem resources, or some combination thereof, reporting it's not an aspect that should be overlooked. Reporting is absolutely crucial.
Andy, so it looks like we do have another question that came in. So is there integration in the other direction? And this person has added, so meaning, what if I'm using a different tool, but I want to see the data visualized in Netreo?
Yeah, actually, so Netreo Essentials does have the ability to do that. As part of the integration features, you can actually publish metrics that are collected in Nagios, Zabbix, a Microsoft SQL Server, or Microsoft SCOM to the UI. And you could then take advantage of, once that data is then into Netreo, you can take advantage of the additional reporting and notification features that the platform has in it.
Okay.
All right.
So,
yeah,
Andy, we actually had another question related to reporting. So
sure.
Are Netreo's reports completely automatic, or do they require manual inputs?
They are. You are actually going to have to schedule them in terms of, so yeah, short answer is you are at least going to have to schedule them. Now, there are several report templates, right? So for example, let's say I want an uptime report or I want a billing report. That stuff would be there. You are still going to have to schedule it to come out, but those are some canned report templates that are there. But everything else, right, you have the ability to very quickly create a report template, then schedule it, and it will be automatic from that point. All right, so the last area, yeah, no worries. Okay, so the last area I want to talk about here is with regard to Azure visibility, right, and management, is that of cost control. Now, keeping IT operational costs under control is something that is very likely on the mind of every IT leader, and with the uncertain business climate we're in these days, it's probably even more prevalent, right, than in times past. Now, there's three aspects of cost control that I want to focus on here. There we go. Okay. So the first is resource auto discovery. Now, and team efficiency is at the heart of this issue, right? While most, if not all, tools designed to monitor Azure resources will handle discovery, there's more involved in that, right? Once the resources are discovered, how do you classify them? How should they be configured with regard to alerting and reporting? We talked about the high resource churn rate when it comes to cloud monitoring in general. If you've moved your resources to the cloud, yes, you've likely been able to take advantage of technologies that would be cost prohibitive if they were deployed on-prem. But if you're still reliant on your engineering and your technical staff to do manual configuration after discovery, there's a lot more cost savings to be had. And Netreo Essentials can get you there as part of its base feature set. Now, also related to the idea of team efficiency is the scenario after your resources have been discovered and configured. Do you have the ability to fire off automated responses to incidents and execute scheduled actions, right? If not, then that's something that should be high on your priority list of enhancements to your environment and your monitoring platform, right? You know, one customer I was recently talking to, as we were putting in the Netreo platform, told me it takes him 5 hours of data mining to prepare reports for his biweekly operations meetings. Now, wouldn't his time be better spent troubleshooting issues or enhancing the environment than pulling the data together, right? I mean, over the years, I've heard other stories from engineers say that, well, when alert XYZ comes out, we know to log into the server and just restart the specified service. Why not just have your monitoring system do that for you, right? The point is there are efficiencies and thus cost of savings to be had by taking advantage of these kind of capabilities, which are likely built into the tools that you use to manage your environment. Now, the last subject I want to tackle with regard to cost control is that of Kubernetes container orchestration. This is actually the perfect segue into the topic we're going to discuss next, which is the new Netreo aaS feature, right? As it pertains to cost control, using container technology with Kubernetes, you're deploying a separate service to handle both resource auto discovery and then also automated responses to adverse conditions. Okay, so that actually wraps up this. So now that I've finished talking about the recommended best practices and kind of the methodology that we go through when we roll out customers, let me briefly pause to see if there are any other questions.
Yeah, so Andy, we did have one more question come in. It says, do you have APIs for tool integration? Exempla Gracia Nagios.
Yes, we do. Actually, all of that stuff is published to our documentation site. So our API reference is fully available. So you'll be able to do that integration yourself if you want. Excellent. Okay, so let's see here. All righty. All right, so next topic. And this is the last topic I want to discuss in the session today, and that's the new Netreo Azure Kubernetes service feature set that we just released. Now, just a moment ago, I made the assertion that Kubernetes can help you with cost control efforts in your IT architecture. Okay, great. However, in order to back that claim up, first it requires a small bit of synopsis on the technology we're talking about here. So you can think of what follows, right, is an extreme Cliff Notes version of what Kubernetes is and why it's useful. Okay, now Kubernetes doesn't have any real meaning or usefulness outside the world of microservices. Great. So what are microservices and what is a microservice architecture? Well, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I've included that here because if I drone on for another 1,000 words, I'm likely to put all of you into a boredom-induced coma. Probably the easiest way to think of a microservice is that it's a small, manageable, quote-unquote, chunk of an otherwise large application. Those chunks then all talk to each other, usually via RESTful HTTPS API calls, right? And there are a number of benefits that come with deploying your applications using microservices, and I've listed them out here. Most of them should be fairly self-explanatory. Now, this is important within the context of this webinar because microservices are a natural fit to the kinds of services typically offered to customers by Microsoft Azure and other providers in the space. Okay, so now we have a 50,000-foot view of what microservices are. The next building block required for Kubernetes is something known as a container. Now, containers are an operating system level virtualization technology, and it delivers software in isolated bundles that contain everything they need to do their job. So libraries, configuration files, everything. Now, there's a couple things worth noting about this particular slide. First, I put a couple images up here on the slide as it's sometimes helpful to talk about containers within the context of legacy hardware virtualization. It can help clarify the concepts if this is new for anybody. This was certainly the case for me when I started learning about Kubernetes and containers and things like that. Okay. Now, the second thing is I called out Docker specifically because they're the most well-known container platform in use today, but other platforms do exist as well, and Kubernetes can also take advantage of them. Okay, so now that we've established the building blocks of microservices and containers, we can get into Kubernetes itself. So what exactly is it, right? The most succinct definition is that Kubernetes is a system for automating application development, scaling, and management. Now, that might lead somebody to ask, why do you need a whole system to do that? The very simple answer is to look back at the previous two slides, right? I mean, as a business and end user, from a business and end user level perspective, microservice architecture is fantastic. However, at a technical level, it is complex, and there is no way to put a happy face on that. There are a ton of moving parts involved, and you're going to want management of that. And I mean, it turns out, Kubernetes came about as a way to tame this complexity. And since microservices are a natural fit for service providers like Microsoft, from their perspective, it was probably a no-brainer to offer aaS to their customers. Now, I'm not going to go into deep technical detail about Kubernetes, except to note a few things here in this diagram. The first is that at the heart of Kubernetes is the master node, which you see on the left-hand side of the image, right? It's actually what controls the behavior of everything in your cluster. Right, and then beyond that, you have your nodes and your pods, and then finally your containers. So I think when really boiling things down, it's important to ask why monitoring Kubernetes orchestration is important, right? Using Kubernetes to manage a microservice-based application has the potential to bring myriad benefits to an IT organization. That includes the potential to reduce costs, reduce time to market for services, improve software quality, right, and then smooth your path towards cloud migration. However, with the elevation of Kubernetes to such a level within an IT architecture, it's imperative that it be monitored just like any other mission-critical resource. Netreo's aaS feature set gives customers that capability. Now, like in the previous instances in the presentation, right, adding Netreo aaS visibility to your monitoring inventory is simply a matter of running through the setup wizard and selecting that resource when it's discovered. However, rather than simply talk through these couple of screenshots, let me bring up a demo system that's in a monitoring lab, and we can take a look at that. So let's come in here, let's switch desktops. All right, so if I switch to the desktop of a Netreo Essentials instance, what you're going to see is we end up on the main service dashboard. Now, if we look here along the left-hand side, next to our navigation, we can see all the Azure resources that have been discovered in our lab tenant. And right here, we've got our sample aaS cluster. So if we expand this out, there's a few interesting items to note, right? Now, when I click on this little histogram icon here, it's going to expand out and show me the overall performance at a cluster level, right? So I can see my cluster CPU utilization, and I can see my memory utilization over here on the side, okay? Now, then if I look at some of these other icons here, right? If I look at this particular link, right, this is going to give me my list of pods that are running within this cluster, right? If I come then here and take a look at this, I can see all the nodes that are running within my cluster. And remember, if you remember back from that image, right, a node is the actual computer. I would say physical computer, but we are talking virtual, right, because this is running up in Azure, right? So, right, I've only got one node here. Now, this is a single lab instance, and then that makes sense, right? We're only running a single node, but then there are several pods or several container hosts that live on that particular node. And it's pretty simple, right? This is a lab environment. There's not much to it. But extrapolate that out for a moment to a production application, and you can imagine how complex it gets, right? Now, if I click through some of these other items, right, right here, I can see cluster events, right? So all of that stuff actually gets reported. Then it gets reported into Netreo Essentials, and we can start tracking all this. We can also start looking at event management and things like that. Now, as far as setting up monitoring behavior of Kubernetes, right? If we take a look at this here, if I click on this gear, open up, there we go. Okay, and then I look at these metrics, right? I can see all the things that we are actually tracking and all the things we have the ability to do. So we've got jobs and daemon sets and deployments, right? What exactly is a job, right? Right now, there isn't anything running. And if I were to click on that link there, you wouldn't see anything. What's a job? It's basically spinning up a new node or spinning up a container within a node, right? All the things that a cluster will manage for you. So these are all the variables that are here that we can track, get information on, and then obviously alert on, right? Looking at this lightning bolt here, what this actually gives us is the actions that can be taken, right? We were talking about active response before. What kind of command would we like to execute with regard to a status alert for a given variable, right? We have the ability then we can share this data, we can export this data, so on and so forth. So let me actually come back up here to the status dashboard. We had that question before about integrations. Whoops, I'm already on the status dashboard. We had that question before about integrations. If I come down here to account settings, and actually it occurs to me that this is probably pretty small. Let's zoom in a little bit, and let's do it one more. Okay, that's a little bit better. So if we come in here to account settings and I look at notification, oops, not notifications, if I look at integrations, we can see a listing of all the things that we can integrate to. So the question was specific about Slack and then about Teams, right? If I come over here to Slack and click edit, all I have to do is literally fill this format, save it, and then it gets connected as part of an alerting template. Anytime anything gets alerted on, or I shouldn't say anything somebody gets alerted on, anytime a critical condition gets executed, right, that template is going to say, open up the Slack webhook and you're ready to rock and roll. In terms of reporting, I was talking about before, we've got our canned reports that are sitting here, but then you also have the ability within performance reports to customize this based on any variables that you see. Azure subscription billing, right, happens to be one of the canned report templates that are here, and we can look at these individual variables. So there really is a lot here to get you quite far down the path in terms of Azure monitoring. Let me actually go ahead and switch back to the presentation here. All right, so let me pause again really quick for some more questions if anybody has anything.
Yeah, so Andy, we did have one more question come through. So it says,
Sure.
does Netreo provide just monitoring, or is it categorized as APM like New Relic, Dynatrace, AppD?
So that's actually a very interesting question, right? Because the line in this space is getting very much blurred. So Netreo is a full stack monitoring platform, but our perspective is from the bottom up. So starting at infrastructure and moving your way up. Whereas you've got your New Relics and you've got your Dynatraces and things like that, they may very well do infrastructure monitoring. I think they have some of that, but they start from a top-down approach. So they're looking from the APM level, right, from the application level, and working their way down, right? From our perspective, we think bottom up makes the most sense because no matter what, you're going to have infrastructure to deal with, right? Even if that means you are sitting in a remote office with an internet connection, you still have that edge point, right, to get internet connectivity. That's infrastructure you want to watch. Or if you've got a bunch of work from home people, right, that's huge now with COVID. You still want to look at those. At the very least, you want to look at those endpoints. That's going to be important to how things work. So to specifically answer the question, we consider ourselves a bottom-up monitoring full stack platform. All righty. So, whoops, there we go. All right, so as usual, we like to take advantage of these webinars to bring all of you up to date on the news and notes about Netreo, right? So, the first announcement, and so we use this for announcements, right? So the first is the feature that I just demoed, Netreo Azure Kubernetes Service Monitoring, is now available in the Netreo Essentials product. It's part of the basic feature set, and there isn't any kind of an extra license or anything like that to purchase it. It's in there. Second announcement, we're actually really excited about this, is a press accolade. Netreo was just named a high performer on the G2 grids for enterprise monitoring, network monitoring, and IT alerting, right? And then lastly, we are announcing Nugget, and this is right the Netreo user group get together. This will be Netreo's first annual user conference. It's going to be a virtual event held on September 24th. There's going to be 3 tracks: thought leadership, product updates and roadmap, and then training. So for those of you who are customers and interested, the customer call for presentations is going to go out the first week of August. Now, just really quickly here, what is Netreo? Just a quick slide for the folks listening that aren't currently customers. So, just to give you a quick insight into who Netreo is, we're a comprehensive IT monitoring and management solution. Netreo has a 20-year track record of success with global brands that have trusted us to help them get visibility into their mission-critical IT resources. And over that time span, we've achieved a 98% customer retention rating, right? And we also we recently just became the highest-rated vendor on Gartner Peer Insights with a minimum of 10 reviews and a 100% willingness to recommend from our customers. So we've got the track record there, and the customer's super happy with the service. And the product, I should say. Since I'm the product manager, I need to mention that. It's the product and the service. So before I wrap up, let me take one more opportunity to answer some questions here you might have.
Yeah, and Andy, while those questions are coming in, I'm actually going to launch a poll. So please let us know how we can help you further. Oh, so we did have a question come in earlier, and it said, I was late. Can we get a recording of the webinar? Yes, so everybody who has attended today and anybody who registered will receive a link to the recording. So keep an eye out. It's probably going to be about 2, maybe 3 hours from now. You will receive a link to that recording. Also, for all of our attendees, I know a lot of the interest may have been driven by the $20 Amazon gift cards. So in that email that comes out with the link to the recording, there will be a survey for you to enter your preferred email address, first name, last name. That way we can get that gift card out to you. So another question that came through. So can we start this for free?
Yes, actually you can. So we actually have a free trial on the Netreo Essentials page. So you sign up, and it would be like any other web service out there, and it's super simple to set up. I didn't actually go into this in the demo just because I didn't do a full demo of Netreo Essentials, but there's a fantastic and very easy to use wizard. All you have to do is get signed up and kick off the wizard. You'll be guided all the way through, and yeah, you're off to the races after that.
Yep, and so for the audience, I actually just added a link to that in the chat. So that is, you just head to cloudmonix.com, and super easy to sign up.
All right, I think so. Thank you everyone very much for taking time out of your day to participate. I'm sure everyone's incredibly busy. So Kyle and I've been talking, but Kyle, back to you.
All right, thank you, Andy. So I haven't seen any other questions come through, but thank you everybody for all the great questions and the interactivity throughout the webinar. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us, info@netreo.com, and we are happy to help you. And I think I connected with a lot of you on LinkedIn, but you can catch me there as well, and we'll get you anything that you need. So with that, thank you all again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.
Cheers, folks.